It is a dry season morning in June 2019 on a cattle station in the East Kimberley, and a station hand is checking a fence line he has checked 100 times before. What he finds is a dead heifer calf, its throat opened in a way that does not match the pattern of a dingo attack or a crocodile ambush. Around the carcass, the red dust holds tracks, deep, splayed, five-toed, with a long central groove dragged between them, nearly 3 meters end to end. The station owner, a man who has spent decades pulling parentes out of water tanks and shooing them off verandas, drives out to look for himself. He calls a wildlife officer that afternoon. What he says, according to the account later passed between neighboring properties, is short and definite. This wasn't one of ours. The carcass is photographed. A ranger logs the coordinates. And then, in the way these things so often do in country this size, the file goes quiet. No necropsy is completed. No follow-up survey is dispatched. The station returns to mustering cattle, and the incident becomes one more story told at the pub in Kununurra, plausible enough to repeat, strange enough to doubt, and never, not once, resolved. Officially, there is nothing to resolve. Varanus komodoensis, the Komodo dragon, exists on this planet in exactly one place. A cluster of 5 small islands in Indonesia's Lesser Sunda chain, Komodo, Rinca, Flores, Gili Motang, and Padar. The wild population is estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 individuals, all of them inside the boundaries of Komodo National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site patrolled by rangers, monitored by the Komodo Survival Program, and protected under Indonesian conservation law. In 2021, the International Union for Conservation of Nature upgraded the species status from vulnerable to endangered. Every official record, every field guide, every biogeographic map draws the same tight, uncontested boundary. The Komodo dragon is Indonesian. It is endemic. It does not, by definition, exist anywhere else. That word, endemic, is doing more work than it appears to. It describes where a species is found today. It says nothing about where that species came from, and it says even less about what that species is physically capable of doing tomorrow. The question, then, is not whether a Komodo dragon could simply appear off the coast of Western Australia, conjured out of nowhere, defying its own biology. The question is whether an animal whose ancestors walked the Australian mainland for millions of years and whose living descendants still carry the physical toolkit for crossing open water and colonizing new ground, is entirely incapable of retracing, even occasionally, even rarely, a path that runs in the opposite direction from the one the textbooks describe. Look at the geography, and the boundary starts to look less like a wall and more like a gap nobody has finished measuring. The Kimberley region of northern Western Australia covers roughly 420,000 square kilometers, an area larger than Germany, and holds one of the lowest human population densities on the continent. Arnhem Land, its neighbor to the east across the top end, adds tens of thousands of square kilometers more. Sandstone escarpment, monsoon floodplain, mangrove coast, and vast stretches of savanna that see a vehicle, let alone a trained herpetologist, perhaps once a decade. Systematic reptile surveys across this country are sparse, underfunded, and logistically brutal, conducted in short seasonal windows, across a landscape that floods for half the year and turns to cracked earth for the other half. Wildlife agencies do not claim comprehensive coverage of Kimberley reptile fauna. They cannot. Nobody has the staff or the budget to walk that much country. And directly to the north, across a body of water that narrows in places to a few hundred kilometers, sits Timor, the closest major landmass to the islands where Komodo dragons are known to live, and a stepping stone toward Flores, Rinca, and Komodo itself. Between Timor and the Kimberley coast lies a scatter of small, largely uninhabited islands and reefs. Ashmore, Cartier, Browse Island, sitting less than 200 kilometers off the Australian shore. The kind of intermediate footholds that, across geological time, have turned impossible crossing into manageable one for more than one species. This is not open Pacific. This is a shallow, island-studded, monsoon-swept corridor, part of the same continental shelf system that connected Australia and New Guinea to the Indonesian archipelago when sea levels dropped during the Pleistocene. That shelf has a name, the Sahul Shelf, and it is where the story of the Komodo dragon actually begins, not on Flores, but on the Australian mainland itself. In 2009, a team of paleontologists led by Scott Hocknull of the Queensland Museum published a study in the journal PLOS 1 that rewrote the accepted history of the world's largest lizard. Working from fossil deposits across Australia, Timor, Flores, and Java, Hocknull's team demonstrated that the ancestor of Varanus komodoensis did not evolve on some isolated Indonesian island through the classic mechanism of island gigantism. It evolved on mainland Australia, roughly 3 to 4 million years ago, as one branch of a much larger radiation of giant monitor lizards that dominated Australasia for nearly 4 million years. A lineage that also produced Megalania, Varanus priscus, a 5-meter apex predator that shared the continent with early humans before vanishing around 40,000 years ago. The Komodo dragon's own ancestors dispersed westward from Australia, reaching Flores by roughly 900,000 years ago, while Megalania and at least one other giant varanid species, a previously unknown lineage identified from fossils on Timor, larger even than a modern Komodo dragon, held on in Australia far longer. It was not lost. That is the plain fact sitting underneath the entire mystery. The Komodo dragon's presence on 5 Indonesian islands is not the species occupying its true, original home. It is the last surviving fragment of a much larger Australasian range, preserved on Flores and its neighbors purely because that is where extinction happened to stop. Everywhere else, the lineage existed, mainland Australia included. The animals died out. The 5 islands are not a cradle. They are a refuge. And refugees, when the pressure that created them lifts even slightly, do not always hold their populations forever. For most of the last several 100,000 years, no pressure lifted. No mechanism existed to carry the animal back east across a widening, current-swept sea. Then, sometime before written history, one did. Long before European ships reached northern Australia, seafarers from the port city of Makassar on the island of Sulawesi began sailing south each year on the northwest monsoon to fish the coasts of Arnhem Land and the Kimberley for trepang, sea cucumber, dried and processed for the Chinese market. Dutch colonial records confirm the trade was well established by the mid-1700s. Rock art in Arnhem Land, depicting Macassan praus and oral traditions among Yolngu communities, suggest contact reaching back further still, possibly into the 1500s. Hundreds of vessels made the crossing annually, working the coastline for months at a time before riding the return trade winds home. A relationship that persisted for roughly 2 centuries until the Australian government banned the practice in the early 1900s, and the last prau from Makassar sailed home in 1907. For 200 years, and, if the oral histories are accurate, considerably longer, vessels departed from waters within a short sail of Komodo, Rinca, and Flores, made port along a coastline that sat within easy dispersal range of every animal the Lesser Sunda Islands were known to carry, and repeated that journey annually for generation after generation. Trepang was not the only cargo those praus carried. Fresh water, timber, provisions, and stowaway wildlife of every description have accompanied maritime trade routes since maritime trade began. The brown tree snake did not reach Guam by choice, and rats did not colonize the Pacific by swimming. A corridor built for sea cucumber does not exclude a curious juvenile lizard climbing into a hold, an egg clutch buried in ballast sand taken on at a Flores beach, or a subadult riding storm debris from an island where dragons are known, occasionally, to raft. None of this needs to have happened often. It only needed to have happened once, or a handful of times, across 2 centuries of continuous, unmonitored, undocumented contact between the islands where the species survives and the continent where it began. If you have followed the argument this far, you already understand why this channel exists. We are not here to tell you what science has closed the book on. We are here for the cases it hasn't. The animals, the record says, shouldn't be there, and the evidence, however partial, that keeps suggesting otherwise. If that's the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe, because this one is far from finished. The physical case for what the animal itself is capable of doesn't rest on the trade corridor alone. Komodo dragons are, by the standards of terrestrial reptiles, genuinely strong swimmers. They propel themselves with powerful, laterally undulating tails, folding their limbs against their bodies to streamline through the water, and they have been documented crossing several kilometers of open channel between islands within their existing range, reaching burst speeds well over 10 kilometers an hour when motivated. Their physiology gives them the tool. What a 2018 decade-long study by ecologist Tim Jessup of Deakin University, published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, found is that they mostly choose not to use it. And that distinction matters enormously to this investigation, because it separates capability from behavior. And behavior is exactly the variable that changes under pressure. Think of it less like a locked door and more like a very strong swimmer who has simply never needed to leave the pool. The muscle, the technique, the lung capacity, all of it is there, proven, documented. What's missing, most of the time, is a reason. Population pressure is a reason. Where Komodo dragon numbers press against the carrying capacity of Flores, Rinca, and Komodo, limited prey, contracting habitat from tourism development and wildfire, and documented genetic inbreeding from generations of restricted movement, dispersal becomes less a matter of preference and more a matter of necessity for a young, displaced, or subordinate animal. A 3-million-year-old dispersal instinct does not vanish because an island happens to be running out of room. The physical evidence for the animal's capacity and the ecological pressure for it to occasionally act on that capacity is not enough to confirm a living population in Australia. It is not enough to dismiss one either. That refrain deserves to sit against its strongest counterargument, because the counterargument is real, and it is scientifically serious. Jessup's decade of GPS and radio collar tracking, conducted at 10 sites across Komodo National Park by the Komodo Survival Program, followed over 1,000 individually marked dragons through repeated recapture. Only 2 were ever recorded, having moved between separate monitoring sites. Only 2, across 10 years of continuous observation, were ever seen in open water at all. The prevailing scientific conclusion is that Komodo dragons are, overwhelmingly, homebodies, creatures that settle into a single valley at hatching and rarely leave it, deterred less by inability than by the real risk that strong inter-island currents pose of being swept toward islands with no food and no mates waiting. If the species barely disperses between islands, it already shares a straight width, the skeptic's case runs. How could it possibly be crossing hundreds of kilometers of open Timor Sea to reach a continent it hasn't touched in 900,000 years? It's the strongest objection in this entire investigation, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than argued around. But even Jim McGuire, a herpetologist at the University of California, Berkeley, who reviewed Jessup's findings, noted something the study itself couldn't resolve. Tens of thousands of years ago, this species occupied a far wider range than it does now, and it remains genuinely unclear whether today's homebody behavior is an ancient, fixed trait or a comparatively recent contraction, a response to shrinking habitat and dwindling numbers, rather than a hard biological ceiling the species has always lived under. A population under pressure, in other words, is not the same population the 10-year study characterized as content to stay put. And even that study's own numbers concede the point it's cited to close. 2 individuals, out of more than 1,000 tracked, chose the water anyway. 2 is not 0. 2, over 2 centuries of unmonitored trade route contact rather than 10 years of scientific observation, is not a number that closes the door. It is a number that leaves it ajar. The skeptic raises 3 further points, and each deserves a direct answer rather than a dismissal. First, if Komodo dragons were established in northern Australia, wouldn't Indonesian park rangers have noticed a population decline at the source? Not necessarily. A handful of dispersing juveniles or subadults, drawn from a population numbering in the thousands, would register as statistical noise against normal mortality. not as a measurable drop requiring explanation. Second, aren't sightings of oversized monitors simply misidentified parentes, Australia's own giant lizard, which can reach 2.5 meters and is famously shy of humans? This is the single most persuasive counterpoint available, and any honest investigation has to concede that most reports almost certainly are exactly that. But most is not all, and a rancher who has spent a lifetime handling parentes, as the East Kimberley station owner had, is precisely the witness whose misidentification claim carries the least weight, not the most. Third, even if a dragon crossed, wouldn't the carcass, the tracks, the physical proof eventually surface for good? Only if something is looking. Tropical decomposition in monsoonal country erases soft evidence within days. Scavengers, heat, and seasonal flooding do the rest. And across a territory the size of the Kimberley and Arnhem Land combined, nobody found proof, and proof doesn't exist are not the same claim. They are separated by a gap in surveillance coverage that dwarfs the gap of open water the animal would need to cross in the first place. The 2019 East Kimberley incident was never resolved. No agency ever returned to that fence line with the kind of survey effort that might have settled the question one way or the other, and it was not, according to station hand accounts passed along neighboring properties in the years since, the only report of its kind. Livestock found torn in ways that didn't match known predators, tracks too heavy and too splayed for a parente, always in remote, rarely surveyed country, always fading from official attention before anyone with the right expertise arrived to look. A pattern built from silence is still a pattern. It is simply one that official channels have no incentive, and often no capacity, to chase. Picture, one more time, that morning in June 2019, the dead calf, the drag mark, 3 meters long, trailing off into spinifex and red dust, the station owner on the phone saying what he saw and being unable to make anyone act on it. The file went cold, not because the case was solved, but because nobody with the resources to solve it ever arrived. Somewhere between the fossil beds of Queensland, where the ancestor of every Komodo dragon alive today first stood on Australian ground 3 million years before Flores existed, and a fence line in the East Kimberley where a rancher found a kill he couldn't explain. There is a question that modern record-keeping has never actually closed, only stopped asking. Extinction drew the boundary that geography once refused to draw. Whether biology has quietly begun to erase that boundary again, one crossing, one unrecorded juvenile, one unmonitored decade at a time, is not a question anyone has disproven. It is a question almost nobody has gone looking to answer. And in a landscape this vast, that absence of an answer is its own kind of evidence.